Good morning. First of all, a couple entries ago, my May 2nd entry has only been seen by 4 people. So it brings to mind in The Lord of the Rings what Elrond said to Gandalf, our list of allies grows thin. I'm going to go ahead and put that image up here, having screen captured it, and let's see if YouTube catches it. We'll see if they're using artificial intelligence and facial recognition, or if they're just catching the metadata on the file. If you don't see that image, you will know that I had to re-edit it and take that out. Now, in my last entry, I happened to mention that in the poem, ostensibly by the future Elizabeth Barrett Browning, called Lady Geraldine's Courtship, there is a particular stanza which refers to Abby. Matter of fact, the whole poem is written in tribute to Abby when she was quite young and teaching Mathew, probably at least 15 anyway, and possibly even younger, because I think she tutored him maybe from age 12 or even younger than that for quite some years. But their courtship really started at about age 15, 16. He was 4 years older, so 19 and 20 for Mathew. And that would have been the period that Mathew was writing about. But this particular stanza talks about her singing when they would be out in nature and studying, and they'd be, discussing and arguing and so on. And she was very patient with his worldly skepticism, which it talks about. And then there'd be a lull and she would just break out in singing. Well, she was a musical prodigy as well as being a literary prodigy. And that's one of several descriptions that Mathew has given us of her singing. Now, I'm going to read one of them. It's a humorous story, so we'll get into that in a minute, which shows you what Abby was really like as a young lady, musically. But this is The Drama of Exile and Other Poems by Elizabeth Barrett. This is volume 1, the one that contains Lady Geraldine's Courtship. This is the version that was published in 1845 in America. She published her own that was just called Poems in 1844 in England. And I'm going to read you that stanza because I had an epiphany yesterday. Suddenly I realized what was really going on in that stanza that it had always bothered me. It never quite sounded right to me. And then I realized what must have happened, and it's kind of interesting. I have written a paper on that, and it'll get published later on this year, first in Real Paranormal Magazine, and then I will post it on Academia EDU. But so I'm not going to go into that in great depth, but since I mentioned it last time, I thought I'd bring it in here. So they're out studying, and then there's a pause, and the stanza reads, as it was published, "After, when we were grown tired of books, the silence round us flinging a slow arm of sweet compression, felt with beatings at the breast, she would break out on a sudden in a gush of woodland singing, like a child's emotion in a god, a naiad tired of rest." Now, this is probably the most specific reference to Abby that's in the whole poem, because he many times speaks of her as a water sprite or a river sprite or a naiad, that's what a naiad is. So there's 4, 5, 6 references to Abby as a river sprite. I've shared some of them. So we know he's talking about her. But this line, like a child's emotion in a god, well, she was a child. She was 15, or he may be thinking back even younger. But a child's emotion in a god, that's a childish god. That's a god who has childish emotions. See, it doesn't fit. Then I realized, oh my gosh, that's reversed. Barrett reversed it. It originally read, like a god's emotion in a child. That was Abby, a prodigy, an old soul, see? She was like this little girl who had a God's perception, a God's experience, not just emotion. It may not even have been emotion, the original word. Could have been a God's experience in a child or something. We don't know. But Barrett has messed with this. And whenever Elizabeth Barrett messes with Mathew's poetry, she doesn't have any idea of what it means. This is the thing. She's clueless. So when she makes a change, it has nothing to do with the meaning of the thing. She destroys it. This is the same thing that Dickens did when he got his big thumb into A Christmas Carol. Someday it'll be totally obvious to people. They'll say, oh, why didn't I see that, right? Anyway, I just thought I'd share that because it just hit me like a ton of bricks. I said, no wonder it didn't sound right, All right, so I'm going to put my antiquarian volume over here safely, and we're going to get into a story that appeared in the November 10, 1849 Boston Weekly Museum. This is a newspaper that Mathew was a heavy contributor to from its launch in mid-1848 until its demise in mid-1852. And it's a long story of Mathew's relationship with this paper, but just to let you know that between the style and certain autobiographical clues and the fact that it appeared in the Weekly Museum and the opening, I have no question but that Mathew originally wrote this story. It could have been embellished by someone. So this is the way he opens it. It says, Deacon Goodman, the man that would sing in meeting. And first of all, this is about a tone-deaf deacon. Mathew loved to write about deacons. I actually have put together a little book of the deacon stories of Mathew Franklin Whittier. It's an ebook that contains a whole bunch of deacon stories by Mathew. Nobody has ever bought that book. It's excellent. It contains this story in it. So this is yet another deacon story from Mathew, but he says in brackets under the title, and one might think this was from the editor, but if this was from the editor, it would be above the title, not below the title. See, because the editor would introduce the story, then comes the title, and then comes the story. This is after the title, which means that the person submitting this is writing this explanation in brackets, which is to say Mathew. And he says, the following laughable sketch is said to be written by Professor DeWolf of Bristol, Rhode Island, and it is said he is Catholic. However, it is good, let it be whose it may. That's Mathew's way of saying this was plagiarized or falsely claimed by or for Professor DeWolf. And he gives the proof because this is not a Catholic church that this story takes place in. So Mathew says it's said that he's Catholic, which means he could not possibly have written this story from personal experience. Okay, that's Mathew's very polite way of saying that it's not Professor DeWolf's story, which means it's his story. Now, the gist of this is, it's a long story. I'm going to read only a portion of it, which is long enough as it is. The gist is that this deacon is tone deaf and he doesn't realize that he's tone deaf, and he firmly believes, this is New England, he firmly believes that singing is like praying and that everybody should have the right to pray and sing in church. So he ruins the singing, especially in this case, because what they've done is they've got a little girl who is a prodigy to sing a piece by Mozart, as a solo. And the deacon doesn't doesn't respect the situation, so we say. This little girl is Abby. So this will give you a very good idea of what she's like. And you will note there's a couple clues in here. I don't want to stop in the middle of reading to point them out, but one of them is that he calls her the prettiest little girl in the village. That's because it's Abby, and he married her. And there's, there's one other one. There's a couple girls from Boston who are like musicians, or if not professional musicians, expert musicians. And they say that for a country girl, she's a prodigy. So it's a real left-handed compliment. And it must have really burned Abby at the time, and so much so that she told it to Mathew, who included it in his story. See, so that was real life, and it it pissed her off. Okay, so with those two things, now we're going to start. But there is a point beyond which forbearance is no longer a virtue. Great pains had been taken by the choir in getting up a new anthem selected from Mozart for Thanksgiving Day, and the very gem of a piece was a solo, which had been assigned to the sweetest voice and the prettiest little girl in the village. All who attended the rehearsals were perfectly delighted with the solo as sung by, quote, Little Mary. It was very difficult. It was marked from beginning to end. Adantino, dolce, affectuoso, crescendo, pianissimo, with changing keys and flats and sharps springing out from unexpected places. But she had conquered it all. 3 or 4 accomplished singers who had come from Boston to pass Thanksgiving in the country and who attended the last rehearsal were in raptures with Little Mary singing. They had heard Tedesco and Biscaccianti and Madame Bishop, and yet they say, for a country girl, she is a prodigy. In due time, Thanksgiving Day arrived, and while the, quote, second bell was ringing, news came to the village that a very serious accident had happened to the Universalist minister. His horse had thrown him, and either his leg or neck were broken. The boy who had brought the news had forgotten which. I hope it is not his neck, said a rich and charitable old church member. When Deacon Goodman heard that remark, he held up his hands and exclaimed, I never. Now the deacon dearly loved good preaching, and the meeting house was to him a house of feasting. But his religion was of a very practical kind, and although he thought but precious little of his great works, he took care to do a good many of them, and was far from believing, with Arnsdorf, that, quote, good works are an impediment to salvation. So said he to Mrs. Goodman, do you go to the house of feasting and get all the good you can, and I will go to the house of mourning and do all I can. And away he went to see, and, if possible, to relieve the Universalist minister. In the meantime, the congregation assembled, and the worship proceeded in the usual way. At length came the anthem. It even went beyond expectation. A long rest preceded the solo. It was no rest for poor little Mary. It was the most anxious minute she had ever passed. She arose blushing and trembling. Her agitation gave a tremor to her voice, which added to the pathos of the music. It was beautiful. Now, Deacon Goodman always made it a rule when any accident had detained him until after worship had commenced to come in very softly. How different from the fashionable flourish! All were intent on the solo. None heard and but few saw Deacon Goodman enter his pew and take up the sheet on which the words of the anthem were printed. Unlike that of many singers, the articulation of Little Mary was perfect. The deacon soon found the piece, and to the astonishment of the congregation, indignation of the choir, and the perfect horror of Little Mary, he struck in and accompanied her through the solo. Accompanied, oft in the stilly night, accompanied by Captain Bragg's battery, would give some notion of it. Poor Little Mary was sick a fortnight. Why don't you cut that old fellow's tongue off, said one of the Boston singers. What good would it do, said the choir leader. He would howl through his nose. They were all very cross. As for the deacon, he looked around as innocent as a lamb and thought he had sung as well as any of them. That's definitely Abby, as a little girl, as a musical prodigy. So we know that Abby was a musical prodigy. That is the same girl you see in Lady Geraldine's Courtship, singing a God's emotion in a child. All of these pieces tie together. Skeptics want the big one on a silver platter, so they don't have to take much time. They want what the mediums sometimes do. You know, John Edward told one person he was reading, I remember, there's a dead mouse in a wedding dress in the attic or something to that effect. And indeed, this fellow had just, or this woman, I think it was, had just recently gone up in the attic, looked at her old wedding dress and found a dead mouse in it. The mediums do that over and over and over and over and over. Dr. Ian Stevenson was able to get impressive past life memories like that. Like I've mentioned that when I interviewed Dr. Jim Tucker, who is the successor to Dr. Ian Stevenson, he told me they had a case in which a little girl had remembered successfully and correctly 25 first names from her past life. He didn't say if she made 5,000 guesses, but presumably she did not. Now it's a done deal, okay? My research is a little different. I have a few of those zingers like that, but mostly it's cumulative evidence. It's death by a thousand cuts. It's this reference to Abby as a naiad and a river sprite. It's this one, it's this one, it's this one, it's this one. All of them, the Kappa, Lambda, and Mu they signed together. Over and over, it's 5 different references to Abby as a river sprite. And then we have one in Lady Geraldine's Courtship. It's, a reference in one of Mathew's tribute poems to Abby called To a Bright Lady, about her singing. It's this reference to Abby as a musical prodigy, singing as a little girl, like 10 or whatever she was. And a whole bunch of other references to Abby as an expert singer. And then it's the reference in Lady Geraldine's Courtship. This is not magical thinking. It looks like magical thinking if you don't have this database of knowledge of Mathew's works that I have. If anybody would take the time to read Mathew's works as I have done, and to read my books where I've condensed this information, condensed it into 2,280 pages in the first book and 700 pages in the second book. That's condensing. See, I've got so much evidence. If anybody had the knowledge base about Mathew, and this knowledge base is searchable, keyword searchable, instead of me giving them a little bit and a little bit and a little bit, which skeptics can dismiss one at a time, you can take this evidence one at a time and dismiss each one at a time. You cannot dismiss the whole, because that's the nature of my evidence. I have this massive database of evidence, which I can bring to bear on any one of these claims. And then I have 5, 6, 7, 10 zingers, see? Well, if I give you just the zingers, that might or might not be convincing. If I give you any of the smaller pieces, which are part of a larger whole, those can be dismissed. That's coincidence. That's coincidence. This is a coincidence. This has no bearing, see, on Lady Geraldine's Courtship, because we all know that Elizabeth Barrett Browning wrote that poem, see? But if you get into the history like I've done, and you see Elizabeth Barrett's explanation to her friend and mentor, Hugh Stewart Boyd, as to how she happened to write that, you'll see that it's clearly BS. It's a very poor lie. It's like a childish lie that nobody in their right mind would ever believe. It's like Charles Dickens claiming to have written A Christmas Carol in 6 weeks in his leisure time to get himself out of debt. Why has nobody questioned that? It's so obviously bullshit. He couldn't possibly have done any such thing. I look at that in my paper and I, blow through that lie. It's the way he's described it, it's logistically impossible that he could have actually done that. Hasn't anybody else questioned it? It's the thraldom of what everybody knows, So with that, I'll sign off. Keep this one kind of short. Since I had mentioned this stanza in Lady Geraldine's Courtship, I thought I should follow up. And since I had mentioned that Abby was a musical prodigy and had a wonderful singing voice, I thought I'd substantiate that. And it's a great story. You really should buy my book, The Deacon Stories of Mathew Franklin Whittier, because they're all really good. He really was an excellent storyteller. I think that his paternal uncle, Moses, who was like a bachelor, kind of a backwoodsman fellow, he must have been an excellent storyteller, because I think that Mathew learned a lot of his storytelling ability from that. Now, if you look online, look up Bert, and I, and the stories that are told in the New England accent, the old-timey stories. These are the kinds of stories that Mathew would have grown up with and that his uncle would have told him in the accent, which I love, but I can't really successfully imitate. And you'll get a sense of the kind of humor that Mathew imbibed from his culture. But Mathew apparently, and he knew this at some point, was a reincarnated rabbi. And these are really teaching stories. So Mathew has taken the New England storytelling tradition and he's brought in from his past life the rabbinical teaching stories and melded them together. So Matthew's stories are teaching stories, but they're within that New England tradition. See, there's so much that I would like to explain about Matthew's work. I can't get past the first part. I can't get past, is reincarnation real? And did Matthew write these stories that have been plagiarized by people famous and obscure? I'm trying to get past those two stumbling blocks, not because they're so important in themselves. It's not that important for me to establish that in my past life I wrote something famous. What's important is to understand Mathew and Abby, who they are, what they wrote, and get into it, get into the depth of it. See, I can't get anybody to get into the depth of it because they're so stuck on these 2 points. Reincarnation isn't real. It's nonsense. And everybody knows that Charles Dickens wrote A Christmas Carol, and everybody knows that Elizabeth Barrett Browning wrote Lady Geraldine's Courtship. I can't get past the everybody knows to get into the real essence of the thing, which is what's really valuable. You get me started, I feel very strongly about this. So that's enough for today. Who knows what I'll see. Maybe we'll get more than 4 views on this one, hopefully. There are a few people looking at my article yet, my paper on Charles Dickens and A Christmas Carol. I see the numbers that are downloaded. I see when somebody looks at it on Academia EDU. I think in the last 5 days, we're probably talking maybe 20 to 25, maybe 25 downloads or views. Sometimes people just look at 3 pages, whether they come back. Some people come back. You see them listed multiple times. They come back and they read 3 pages, and then it bothers them, and they come back and read another 2 pages, and then it bothers them some more. So the next day they come, I understand, because they're dealing with something that's impossible that has solid evidence. It's the irresistible force meets the immovable object, I understand. So what happens is you dismiss it and it bugs you, and you come back, and you dismiss it and it bugs you, and you come back again. See? This is why I'm not too worried about not getting any response now. I expect not to get any response now. I expect that people will be introduced to it. They'll recoil from it. They'll laugh nervously. It'll bother them. They'll come back. They'll talk about it with colleagues. Both of them will laugh about it and ridicule it. It'll bother them. In the middle of the night, they'll get up and look at a little more of it. It'll go like that for a while. So then we'll see what happens after that.